If you've ever taken a photo that's too bright or too dark, you'll know just how important it is to learn to control your exposures. In this exercise, we're going to learn how to use exposure compensation, which is a technique that you can use in aperture priority, shutter priority, and program mode to make your images brighter or darker when you need to. Your camera doesn't always get it right, so you need to learn how to take control. We're going to do this exercise in aperture priority mode, but it works the same for shutter priority and program. So put your camera to aperture priority or AV mode now. Then set your ISO. If you're indoors, 800 is a good place to start. All right, you're going to need a subject as well, and we're ready to go. So there are 3 general lighting situations that you're going to encounter, and your camera will react differently in all of them. The first one is an evenly lit situation, which is what it sounds like. The light is even. So we're going to use Obi-Wan to demonstrate. He is the subject, and you can think of me as the background. The light on the subject and the background is pretty much the same. It's even. And that's the kind of situation that your camera was built for. It's going to have no problem giving you a really great exposure, and you don't really need to do anything. But there are other situations that you need to learn how to control. One of those is called backlit, and that's when the background is much brighter than your subject. So let's practice shooting in a backlit situation. Put your subject in front of a really bright background, and a perfect scenario is with a bright window behind them. Now the background is way brighter than the subject, and your camera's going to have a bit of trouble. So let's take a photo and see what happens. Now, before we do this, make sure that the point on your exposure indicator is right in the center. You might have to check your manual to learn how to move the exposure compensation in aperture priority mode, but get it to the center and then take a photo. Now, what you should see is that your subject looks quite dark. The camera is trying to balance out all the lights and darks in the scene, but because there's so much bright stuff from that bright background, the subject ends up looking quite dark. You're going to have to take some control and say that it needs to be brighter than what the camera thinks. So, increase your exposure compensation in the positive direction for some overexposure and take another photo. Now, the camera thinks it's overexposed, but when you look, you see that your subject is nicely exposed and you got a good exposure. You really do have to take control in backlit situations. Let's look at the other kind of tricky light that you might encounter. That's when the light on your subject is good and nice and even, but the background is quite dark. So I'm going to put Obi-Wan on this side now, and the light from the window is making him look good, but because there's this dark black table behind him, there's a really dark background. So we'll put our exposure compensation back to 0, so change that dial back to 0 and take another photo. And what you will probably see here, you should see, is that your subject is now too bright. Again, the camera is trying to balance this all out because there's so much dark, it ends up trying to bring it back and makes your subject too bright. So in that kind of situation where your subject looks too bright, you're going to have to decrease your exposure compensation. You're going to have to put it in the negative direction and tell your camera to underexpose from what it thinks should be right. So decrease your exposure compensation in the negative direction and take another photo. And now you should see that your subject is nicely exposed for. It doesn't look too bright. So those 2 situations you're going to find yourself encountering quite a bit. And you really need to know how to use your exposure indicator or your exposure compensation to get the exposure that you want. If it looks too bright or too dark, you need to take some control over the camera and adjust. One thing to keep in mind is to always bring your exposure compensation back to 0. You might forget and leave it there after you've been in a backlit situation, and then everything will look overexposed. So always keep an eye on that indicator. Always adjust your compensation depending on the scene. And the more you practice this, the more you'll start to be able to see that the scene should be overexposed or underexposed because you know that it's backlit or there's a dark background. So practice with this a lot and look at the results and see, is my subject too bright? Is my subject too dark? And use your exposure compensation to get those great exposures that you like.